for prisoners, and I commend this bill to the House.
Honourable Leanne Dalziel.
Mr Speaker, that member obviously doesn't have a very good recollection of the matter coming before our Select Committee just a short while ago. This legislation, when it was originally introduced, was introduced as a short-term measure, and that was the reason for putting a sunset provision into it. I think it's had about 3 sunset provisions, 2007, 2010, 2012, and now the 2013 deadline is starting to loom, which is why we're dealing with it again. What is kind of frustrating to this side of the House is that we agreed to extend the expiration of the Act earlier this year in order to provide a temporary measure in lieu of the alternative government bill, which would have made these restrictions permanent. And of course that bill has disappeared from the order paper, and the member who's just resumed his seat didn't even mention the Prisoners and Victims Claims Redirecting Prisoner Compensation Amendment Bill, known in the RIS as the Redirection Bill, because it's come off the order paper, it's been ditched. And we agreed to have the temporary measure last enacted, and the member is on the Select Committee, so must remember it. We agreed to do that on the basis that that particular piece of legislation was going to have its first reading and be referred to Select Committee. Well, it never came. It never had its first reading, and it was never referred to Select Committee. And so, as a result, we agreed on the basis that the Minister offered to negotiate with the opposition spokesperson on justice, my colleague Charles Chabelle, and other members in this House over the content of the measure, and of course she's failed to do so in good faith, and that's actually why we're opposing this bill. It is about process, and I think the process is really important. I think that if people actually want to get legislative changes through this House, when there are areas upon which we can work together to achieve agreement, that's what we should seek to achieve, and that's what we sought to achieve. The Minister didn't consult with us about the new bill that she'd introduced, and then she didn't consult about removing it from the order paper, and she didn't consult about this amendment either. And I just think that to turn this, the temporary measure, into the permanent fix actually doesn't solve the problem. And we've heard members opposite talk about victims of crime. If somebody's in prison and they're left a bequest and they inherit a lot of money, it's not caught by this. If they win lotto because somebody gives them a lotto ticket for their birthday, it's not caught by this. This is only caught if their human rights are abused and they receive compensation from the Crown. It is absolutely perverse, and I cannot believe that members of a national government are happily standing up and saying that this legislation is good enough. It isn't good enough. That's why we were prepared to work with the government to find a real fix, which was about a prisoner deriving income at the time that they're incarcerated or deriving some benefit while they are incarcerated, not dependent on having their human rights abused or having compensation paid by the Crown, but actually looking at the whole issue as to whether they should be able to be deprived of some element of what they gain while they're serving their sentence, so that the benefit of that can pass on to a victim if they want that compensation, because I have spoken to victims of crime who don't want any money from anyone that has done to them what they've done. I want to also remind the House that the victims of crime, we talk about what it is that they want, and we are talking about whether the legislation is victim-centric or not. We had a meeting recently with the Sensible Sentencing Trust, and one of their members highlighted to us that there was a real concern about the lack of engagement with the Ministry of Justice and the Minister over some of the issues that are truly of concern to the victims of crime. And what they had discovered was that on the Ministry of Justice website is this incredible document, which is essentially a literature review of all of the issues relating to the adult victims of crime. And right at the end, and this is what they drew to our attention, right at the end it says this: there are guiding principles for providing effective service and support to the victims of crime. A key aim of this report was to provide information on how best to support victims of crime. In reviewing the extensive range of research relevant to crime victimisation, a number of guiding principles emerge as important in delivering effective support and services to victims. These principles are applicable to all agencies, government and non-government, that work with victims of crime. And that is the advantage of actually looking at the international literature. Even our own literature supports this. This is what best practice actually informs the Parliament in terms of decision making. And this is actually what the victims of crime, this is what a victim-centric service provision looks like: respectful and confidential treatment. And it says, available research shows while outcomes are important to victims, e.g. reparation and convictions, consistent with the concept of procedural justice, the manner in which victims are treated is more important. That's what all of the evidence shows. Individualised response and flexible service. There is strong evidence that people are affected differently by crime. Services allocated purely by crime type or victim type are likely to miss other victims with significant needs. Assessment must ensure individual needs are identified, and services need to be sufficiently flexible to provide individualised response. A range of service options should be offered so that individual preferences can be catered for. Then it talks about services being accessible. Services can only assist victims if they are known to victims, victims are comfortable using them, and are available at the time and location where needed. Participation in the justice system can be important to victims and so must be accessible to them. And therefore it talks about services needing to be well advertised and using publicity campaigns to ensure that victims are aware of their existence. Certain services need to be available 24 hours, for example, crisis response. Well, we've just had to have an urgent intervention in Auckland because the crisis centre for sexual violence was about to close its doors at Christmas. So that's had to be addressed extremely urgently. Services and access to justice need also be available in rural and provincial areas. How often do we forget that these services are not just city-based in terms of that support? Services and justice responses need to be culturally appropriate and accessible to those from different ethnic backgrounds. Services and justice responses need to be sensitive to the needs of vulnerable populations and accessible to those with disabilities, younger victims, those living in socially and economically deprived areas. And then they talk about provision of right information at the right time in the right format. And how many times could you say that about a whole range of different areas that we should be addressing? Delivered by experienced, knowledgeable, well-trained, empathetic staff. Consistent, high-quality services and support, integrated service provision, end-to-end individualised support, accountable services. So those are the things that the victims of crime are actually saying to this Parliament that they would like to have delivered for them. And I don't think that anyone can stand up in this House and say that the Prisoners and Victims Claims amendment bill that we have before us in any way begins to address those particular needs. And I think members opposite, and we'll be looking at it very carefully when it comes to Select Committee, that's the reason we're not supporting it, is that it is a bill that fails to actually address the core needs of victims that have been expressed to us and have been identified by the Justice Ministry as being based on international best practice, the literature, says so, and as I say, the Sensible Sentencing Trust are asking us to look much more compassionately at these issues. So I think it's a very disappointing piece of legislation. The Minister of Justice can do a lot better than this, and I have to say, quite frankly, I'm disappointed with the effort that has obviously not been placed in this particular quarter where it should be.
Alfred Naru.
Mr. Speaker, I stand and rise to take a call on the